She doesn't belong in a kit like that. What does she think she's doing with a backpack full of toys? The insult rolled out loud and arrogant, designed to puncture and display. The crowd laughed. It was the easy laugh, sharp and quick and meant to fold her into the smallness they preferred. She did not flinch. She did not speak. She stood beside a table where a lineup of personnel had been asked to place their gear for inspection. Boots, helmets, plates, the mundane and the sacred. Her uniform fit like any other uniform, plain, sleeves rolled, hair tied back in a seam of discipline. Underestimate her, they had already decided. The gatekeeper had already stamped the judgment. But when the general saw her stance at the table, shoulder relaxed, chin level, hands steady, the laughter thinned into a puzzled silence. There was something in that compact, unadorned posture that did not ask for attention and yet did not invite disrespect. If you think quiet merit matters more than loud credentials, type silence below. The words hung, a dare without voice. The backpack would be stripped in public because rules demanded it, and because the gatekeeper loved spectacle, loved the theater of small tyrannies. He welcomed spectacle the way an arsonist loves a dry field. He wanted to watch a reaction. He wanted to watch the unraveling. The crowd leaned in. Their collective breath was a small wind that smelled of coffee, diesel, and expectation. She let them lean. She let them judge. Her hands kept resting on the table, fingers exploring a seam, the tactile memory of 1,000 kit checks that had been practiced not for theater, but for survival. No retort. No nervous laugh. Silence, thick as winter wool, wrapped her like a scarf. The gatekeeper's voice sharpened as he reached into the pack to pull out a battered field notebook, a ration of protein bars, a compact medical kit. Things that proved a readiness he could understand. He sneered, and then his fingers brushed a cloth-wrapped object at the bottom, something metallic and old, polished by time. What's this? A medal? Oh, please. Did Mommy sew that in for show? The crowd's laughter sharpened into a chorus. She kept her face like flint. The general's eyes moved without comment, registering. The man with the loud voice was comfortable in the space he'd carved. He had a short command of authority and an even shorter memory for humility. They stripped the pack as if performing an execution. The medal, when it emerged, lay on the table with the gravity of history. The gatekeeper scoffed and shoved it toward the bright light, crudely examining the engraving. He said the wrong things. He assumed it was costume, a prop, an affectation. He read a name without the pause of recognition. The room hummed with the sort of small cruelty that has an appetite for spectacle. She responded with a slow inhale, the quiet of someone accustomed to waiting until the smoke cleared. The inspection that followed was less about rules and more about the performance of dominance. He pointed to the medal with a hand heavy with mockery. Name a single operation where they've earned one of these. Oh wait, don't play coy. This is for show. This isn't your kind of work. He was verbose, full of rhetorical swoops, the questions that weren't meant to be answered, only to wound. The onlookers, teens and grizzled staff, some with bones of long deployments and others with the brittle confidence of desk-bred ranks, shifted. An awkward silence tried to wedge itself between her shoulders and the table. She moved her hands through the kit again, a clean folding of a bandage, the precise count of rounds in an en-bloc clip, a check of a worn M210 enhanced sniper rifle stock sealed in a case nearby, each gesture revealing nothing but competence. There was foreshadowing in the way her fingers returned to the rifle's silhouette, in the way the seam of the rifle stock had been nicked once by a tree on a covert exfil, the kind of tiny scar that speaks of 1,000 quiet missions. The gatekeeper smirked and turned to the crowd as if conducting a chorus. See? You can stage anything if you fuss enough, he was loud, his voice a brush that painted her as a caricature. The general's jaw tightened. He watched without interrupting. An observer who had learned that time, not words, reveals truth. When a training alarm sounded from the yard, 3 pulses that meant drill, now, the mood shifted from petty theater to acute readiness. A simulated blackout had been orchestrated for the range. It was the kind of crucible where technique smoothed into instinct. The protagonist's silence remained a steadying presence amid the rising pulse of purpose. She stepped back and folded her hands, small movements deliberate as a surgeon's. She did not look to justify, she prepared. The gatekeeper sneered again and shoved the medal back into the backpack with the arrogance of someone certain his worldview was a fact. When the simulation escalated, multiple targets flagged, a hostage made of a life-sized mannequin, a simulated breach. This is where the narrative snapped taut. Orders flew, clipped and sharp. The inexperienced novices fumbled with wires and radios. The gatekeeper barked commands with a voice elevated beyond its wisdom. The general, in a move that had been years in gestation, allowed the line to find its rhythm. They needed someone to call shots on the sniper nest. They needed stable hands, someone who could see 100 meters like a map and breathe a gunshot into history. Heads turned at the taciturn requirement. The gatekeeper's face grew thin with satisfaction. He saw a chance to include and show off his brand of command. Star him, let him fail, and then retell. The protagonist picked up the M210 from its case with the care of someone who had slept with the weight of responsibility across her chest. The rifle was familiar in a way the gatekeeper could not imagine. It had been a companion through landings that should not have happened, through nights where wind counted as an enemy and heartbeat counts as a metronome. She worked the bolt with a thumb that had learned the angle of precision long before popularity. She checked the scope with a practiced sweep, aligned a world of sights until the chaos narrowed to a single aperture. Anaphora steadied the rhythm of her actions, steady hands, steady breath, steady aim. The crowd's breath held. The gatekeeper's smirk jarred, unaccustomed to silence that was not fear. She did not announce her competence. She simply engaged it. Each click and caress of metal was a sentence in a language only the practiced could read. In the distance, the range's simulated target painted a crimson at its center as if waiting for ordination. The shot, when it came, was not dramatized. It did not roar with the theatrics that the gatekeeper anticipated. It was a clean, surgical sound, a report that felt more like the closing of a door than an explosion. The bullet tore a center through a mannequin's heart with an ease that made the world tilt toward disbelief. The silence afterward was huge, thick as wet canvas. It was the kind of silence that compresses lungs and deflates the loudest voices. For the first time in the room, the gatekeeper stammered. "No," he breathed. The sound was small and brittle. The narrator, observant, almost liturgical, described the aftermath in a voice low and measured. The spent casing that clicked into a palm, the scope lens fogging with the short-lived breath of exertion, the flinch in those who had depended on bluster rather than training. Close-ups in the minds of those present zeroed in on her hands. Unshaken, methodical, the pads of her fingers bearing the faint callus of repeated loading and cleansing. The rifle lay between her and the target like an extension of intent and legacy. The wound the bullet left in a painted chest was a clean hole, no mess of hesitation. The crowd's laughter dissolved into a collective intake of air, the kind you get on high ground when you see the precipice. The gatekeeper looked as if someone had extinguished his glow. He stepped back, tongue drying with the shock of being seen as he was, small. The moment had flipped pitch and direction. The loud had been hushed, the presumed had been proven wrong. The protagonist's mouth remained closed. She gave a single, professional nod when the general approached, an acknowledgement that was not for personal praise, but for the work's necessary recognition. The general moved forward with a gait that had the weight of years and the inevitability of truth. He did not need to ask for records. He already saw the evidence threaded through her posture and the way she had handled the rifle. Still, for the public theater and to correct the record, he asked to see her service file. Those present, witnesses to humiliation now ripe to witness vindication, watched as the validator, older hands steady, opened a small file folder that had the tactile anonymity of bureaucracy. He read the entries out loud, staccato and deliberate, each clause a drumbeat. Unit, Tier 1 Special Operations, classified. The room inhaled. Combat hours, 1,872. The numbers were not ornamental. Medals, Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star, Combat Marksmanship Medal. Each award named was a proof, not a lyric. Missions, classified. 5 known direct action deployments. Multiple foreign internal defense operations. 2 hostage rescue sorties confirmed. The words landed like iron and gold. The gateway of the gatekeeper's arrogance began to crack. The gospel of paperwork concluded with service dates that spanned wars both announced and quiet. The validator's voice dropped into an authoritative cadence that made the room an amphitheater of shame for those who had jeered. He removed his cap in a move that was half ritual, half confessional. The public salute that followed was not theatrical. It was an institutional recalibration. He addressed the gathered crowd with simple finality. Rank matters. Experience counts. Assumptions do not. The punctuation of his words served as a rebuke to the laughing pack. He named her rank and, as tradition demanded, used the formal address, ma'am, despite how unadorned she had been. The gatekeeper's face had all the colors of someone who had been asked to name the weather and found he couldn't. What followed was not simply apology, it was correction. The validator took an action that bore the weight of repair. He assigned her to mentor the novices during the remainder of the exercise. The gatekeeper's protests were thin and inconsequential after the authorities' final word. He found himself reduced to a man insisting on the color of a sunset, while everyone had already moved on to the lessons of dawn. The protagonist accepted the assignment without a flourish. She gathered the rookies and the derided and organized them into stations, each student a rough block waiting to be shaped. She taught not with lectures, but by demonstration. Her pedagogy was a combination of tacit knowledge and exacting drill. "Breathe," she said once, in a voice that was more a calibration than a command. "Check your angles." Her instructions were economical, simple nouns and verbs that cut through adrenaline and uncertainty. Anaphora returned as she repeated the essentials: breathe, align, assess. She shared small stories, brief, elliptical anecdotes that contained whole wars in their pauses. A dead stick landing in a mountain pass. The time a scope missed it over, and she had to trust instinct. The soldier who didn't move because they had been told to freeze, and how that cost everything. The rookies listened because her words were salted with consequence. The gatekeeper, watching, moved through stages: confusion, resentment, reluctant admission. He approached her after a drilling period, his voice stripped of sarcasm. It was a thin, awkward apology. "You were right to be here." "I misjudged," she answered in her pattern. A nod, a short, understood, no gloating. No rubbing salt into old wounds. The general watched the exchange with a grim, satisfied face. It was validation, it was correction. The locker room whispered the next day, and the crowd that had once jeered now carried the story like a small, bright flag. Word spread fast in places where reputation is both currency and armor. The account of the stripped backpack and the forbidden medal moved through the barracks like a fever, retold with a smile, a shaking head, a lesson. An online thread, an internal forum for the base, posted a picture of the medal hung on a cluttered corkboard. A sergeant painted a short plaque and affixed it to the shooting range's control tower, the Morgan line. It read, in plain block letters. The protagonist's name became shorthand for a kind of competence. Do it like Morgan. The gatekeeper found himself the subject of ribbing at stride length and at mess tables, his earlier cruelty reframed by the small rituals of social correction. He learned to keep his jests in check. Where once he might have publicly shamed, now he listened, slow and present. Humility, for him, became a practical training regimen. The legend did not grow on hype, but on repeated observation of steady results. Trainees would come by the range to touch the plaque and feel a shiver of the right kind, the one that tells you that standards matter. The narrator watched the ripple and began to draw the larger arc. How small acts of courage and competence transform cultures when allowed room to breathe. The protagonist kept teaching. She kept her medal in a small locker behind a tactical vest, visible to those who needed seeing. She did not put it on frivolously. She used it as a tool to punctuate a lesson about legacy and stewardship. Respect is earned, she told a nervous recruit who had been mocked for being soft-spoken. Respect your trade. Respect the tools. Respect each other. This became a teaching mantra, a repeating thread that stitched into the unit's fabric. Months slid into a pattern and then into a history. The haunting story of the backpack became a case study in the unit's newcomer orientation. Leaders referenced it in briefings. "Don't assume," they would say. The protagonist was called upon to evaluate new gear and new recruits. She sat on a few boards and always answered in her measured shorthand. She refused personal accolades, but accepted the institutional responsibility of shaping doctrine where needed. The gatekeeper, in time, found his corrective arc complete enough to offer a public admission at a unit assembly. His apology was unadorned and sincere. "I let assumptions do my thinking for me. That was wrong." The proclamation was met with applause, not because he had finally learned the obvious, but because he had made the hard choice to change in front of witnesses. The validator continued to mentor the entire unit, a tacit partnership that kept the memory alive not as gossip, but as instruction. A photograph of the protagonist at the shooting line, rifle on rest, medals subtly in view, was pinned to the training board with a caption that read, "Quiet competence. Loud results." It was a small shrine to the story's theme, that deeds, not declarations, are the currency of respect. Years later, the story was told at graduations as if it were a myth that carried a moral. New officers were sternly reminded to check their assumptions before they checked the boxes on a file folder. The protagonist, older now, scarred in private but unscarred by the vanity of regret, stood at a graduation and watched as a new cohort filed by. She saw herself in the hesitant ones, in the ones who were quiet and steady and whose backpacks were heavy with things the world might not first understand. A cadet came forward, backpack anxious underlining his frame. He had heard the story on the barracks net, half sermon, half legend. He pulled from his bag a small, worn object, a token of his own lineage, and looked up for a measure. She gave a small, certifying nod. The transfer of trust was not a theatrical bestowal but a soft, practical affirmation. Do your work, and the world will catch up. The narrator delivered one last observant note. In the archive, the name on the medal's engraving would be studied by new officers and by historians who liked things tidy. But the real record, the living truth, would be found in the way young hands learned to check their sights and breathe through pressure, and in how a gatekeeper learned to ask before he accused. The symbolic rifle, the salute, the clean shot, they all became mnemonic devices for behavior. The protagonist taught young soldiers the little rituals that matter: a firm handshake, a precise kit check, the correct way to fold a bandage, the exact cadence of a respectful salute. Each act was a seed of competence, planted. True legacy, the narrator said in a voice that echoed the room's own quiet, is not the medals displayed or the stories retold. It is the measure of how the weak and untested are taught to be strong and how the loud are taught to be quiet. It is the instruction that respect must be earned, not presumed, and that competence will always, eventually, outpace arrogance. The protagonist continued her work because the work needed doing. She accepted thanks with a simple, understood. She never sought the spotlight. She let her competence be the light. For more stories where demonstrated skill triumphs over hollow bluster, and where quiet professionalism defines true worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories. The room smelled of coffee gone stale and gun oil, a particular scent that marked places where hands met metal and minds measured angles in silence. Outside the hangar doors, the wind was a thin razor, carrying on it the metallic tang of the airfield, an odor of ozone after a close thunderhead rolled past. Light from the low sun struck the polished butt of a rifle leaning against a crate and made a strip of gold on a surface long dulled by use. The protagonist, her name seldom used, because names can become ornaments for the wrong kind of pride, moved through that light like a machine that had been cared for, not flaunted. Her gloves were plain. The seams had been repaired once, twice, by fingers that had been trained to keep things working. Her hair, tucked back under a cap, caught the dust in a brief halo. She smelled faintly of leather and antiseptic, a practical combination. The smell told those who paid attention that she had been tending wounds and tending weapons in the same breath. Conversation in the hangar was low, voices clipped with the economy learned from habit. The cadet who had shown the worn token to her sat a little way off, palms tight around the object like it was a fragile compass. The token was no ornament. Its worn edges told a history of being carried on long marches and long flights. He had the look of someone whose ideas of heroism were freshly formed, sharp, sincere, dangerous only in their potential to become brittle. He wanted instruction, validation that the path he had chosen would not be wasted, that a quiet life devoted to craft could still be meaningful. He wanted the protagonist to say the world would see him, but she knew the truth. Some things were proven only by doing, and the proof could be lengthy and dull. She offered him, instead, a method, a way to breathe in, find the center, and move. Start with your kit, she said, voice level, unadorned. She demonstrated the motions by habit. Check the stitching of the pack, weigh the rations, tuck the medical dressing into a pocket where it would not snag. The cadet watched, mapping each movement into himself like a translation. Around them, other young faces clustered, hungry for the ritual of initiation, a heel of the boot on the threshold of adulthood. But the protagonist did not play to the crowd. She did not give speeches. She demonstrated. Actions have an economy language's envy. How long before you know? The cadet asked, voice small beneath the vastness of their surroundings. He used the word know, as if knowledge were a fixed window rather than a ledger that filled slowly with entries of failure and correction. Long enough, she said. Long enough to learn how to fail and come back. Long enough to stop pretending. There was no sermon in it. The cadet understood because his fingers tightened on the token and his jaw set. He would be taught the small mercies of competence. How to grease a hinge so it wouldn't freeze, how to check a site with both eyelids open, how to listen in a way that made the world give up its secrets. Those mercies were the architecture of steadiness. When the gatekeeper, the antagonist, came by later that day, his swagger felt unseasonably loud in the quiet of the hangar. He had the look of someone who had been given parchment and a title and decided both were enough. His uniform was neat in a way that advertised itself, pressed in creases like slogans. He carried his authority as others might carry a blunt instrument, swinging it to make a point. The cadet introduced him, and his smile was the sort of thing that expected laughter on demand. He had heard the whispered stories of the protagonist, an urban legend with the edges sanded down by retelling, and thought them amusing in the way people find detritus amusing. So this is the famous quiet one, he said, voice designed to carry. She doesn't talk much, doesn't she? I bet she can't even keep up with a simple exercise. It's always the same. Silence, then stories the size of battles. Where are your medals, by the way? Oh, right. You don't make a show of them. How quaint. The gatekeeper's meaning was clear. He equated silence with vacancy, modesty with an absence of merit. There were eyes on him. A few joined in the easy laughter, the kind that spreads like a net and casts a shadow on the quiet. The cadet flinched. He had been expecting validation in the protagonist's course, not humiliation. The protagonist's face changed, but only slightly. Anger was not something she dressed in. It would constrict what had to remain flowing. Attention, hands, breath. She did not answer with the sting he sought, because the sting would give him oxygen. Instead, she continued calibrating a rifle. The click of the bolt was a metronome, a small ritual of focus. The sound said more than any insult could. You take liberties with the cadets, the gatekeeper continued, sing-song now because performance was his currency. Leave the deep-seated lessons to those with records. You aren't exactly the image of precedent, are you? You might be a useful bit of folklore in a book club, but out here, he gestured at the hangar as if the world itself required his protective shaping. Out here, we need people who demonstrate continuously, who lead, loud and clear, people with presence. Presence is not the same as competence, she said finally, and the voice was a narrow file of sound. She did not rant. She did not inveigh. Her statement was measured, like a report of a sighting. The gatekeeper's smile did not falter, because to falter would be to admit a crack. The crowd chuckled again at her brevity, at the asymmetry between a long insult and a short answer. The cadet, still clutching his token, looked between them and felt the tug of two definitions, presence as performance and quiet as void. He wanted to believe in something cleaner than either, but lacked the long memory to know it was simpler to be patient. The protagonist watched him watch, understanding the inside geometry of that gaze, the way he tested the angles for a view of himself. You'll see. He whispered to the token and then to the protagonist, as if she were a rock that had ears. Are you going to show us? He asked not to provoke, but to be given permission to believe. We do the work, she said. We prepare. We keep the rifle clean. We check the lines twice. We don't make the story ourselves. She put a hand to the cadet's shoulder, not a clumsy gesture of pity, but a constructing touch, like a mason setting a stone. The cadet felt the steadiness in the contact, as if it were a baton passed. Fate, if one liked to think that invisible thing existed, has a taste for economy. That afternoon, a call came in. An aircraft reported a systems anomaly on approach to the field. The voice that relayed it was clipped, edged with the professional used to calling bad news into small rooms and trusting those rooms to do something that was not talk. A medevac on a training sortie off the coast had picked up an engine flame. The pilot had fought to keep the plane aloft. They had sent out a mayday. There were 5 people on board. The protocol board lit up with the kind of quiet attention that did not need applause. People moved with the kind of focused pace that comes from long practice, a not uncoiling into motion. The gatekeeper's confidence wavered in the humid breath of real stakes. Suddenly, loud voices were less useful. Commands over the radio needed execution, not commentary. He had to choose: insult the quiet one and continue being loud, or accept help from the person he'd humiliated. "I'll take point," the protagonist said. She did not ask, she stated. There was a file in her mind: procedures, checklists, equations of lift and drag, the feel of a wheel under a certain load, and she drew from it like a carpenter summoned his tools. She moved to the console and took the time to run the numbers with a hand that had done this before, though she had not said so aloud. Her finger traced a chart, adjusted for weight, wind, and failing systems. Every motion was a small theorem of competence. Around her, the world sharpened. "You're sure?" the gatekeeper asked, and his voice was smaller. He offered the question not as challenge, but as an opening to recapture the agency he'd been told he had. He eyed the protagonist as if she might be 2 things at once, both an answer and an instrument for his redemption. "We're not wasting time," she replied. "I'll coordinate the medevac corridor and set the approach vector. You relay the ground clearance." She kept her sentences short because there was no profit in rhetorical flourish. Words were a currency diverted to necessity. The pilot on approach was a young man with windburn on his cheeks and fear in the way his hands tightened on the controls. Over the comms, his voice was brittle but professional. "Engine 2's gone," he said. "She's heavy. I can't hold her at approach speed." "Cut interior lights," the protagonist said. "Reduce payload, jettison non-essential. You're cleared to dump fuel across Sector 3. We need you light by the time you hit glide." There was a flurry of mechanized compliance. Valves turned, levers pushed, a practiced ballet. The plane cried through the sky, belching the slow, roaring exhale of escaped fuel. The hangar team monitored, sweat on brows, lips moving in geometries of calculation. The protagonist counted the seconds like a man counting breaths before a dive. Time telescoped. Every tick was a decision. On the ground, the runway crew braced. The gatekeeper's hands were dry with the adrenaline of someone learning that authority can be responsibility rather than performance. His orders were no longer theatrical. They had to be crisp and accurate. He passed vectors and clearance with the precision of someone pretending the game had not been cruel. He watched the protagonist and, in the watchfulness, found a crack. The story he had told himself about being vital no longer painted the whole room. The pilot's voice came in again, close to breaking. "She's not holding. I'm going to, a static cut." "Report while you can," she said. "Trim right. Deploy partial flaps. Prepare for controlled impact if we lose hydraulics." She spoke like a calculator and a priest at once because she dealt in both arithmetic and an old kind of mercy. "We have a narrow window. Use it." Copy. The boy's voice was a thread pulled taut. He did what pilots do: reduce, adjust, focus. The aircraft pitched as if testing the Earth's appetite, and then slid into that sweet, perilous place where physics and the human will are traded. On the runway, men and women squinted against the glare as the plane's approach came into view. One wing listing, the fuselage a sculpture of strained metal doing the impossible work of holding together. Then a sound that will remain in people's mouths for years. The sickening wrench as the landing gear skidded across a runway not intended for such a craft under such duress. Sparks shelled out like small suns. For a moment, everything held suspended as if the universe were deciding which story it would tell about them. Then the aircraft came to rest, smoking, an ungainly titan that had been made of wills and calculation rather than pretension. Men ran. A stretcher team swung into formation. The gatekeeper sprinted, the authoritative gait replaced by the gait of someone bearing responsibility in his bones. Inside the hull, the protagonist moved with the kind of calm efficiency that looks like choreography until you realize choreography has never borne witness to the improvisational math of human danger. She pulled open a door, slid into a cabin half dark and full of braced faces. Her hands were sure, not rapid, not anxious, but impeccably efficient. She called instructions to the medic at her side. Check airway. Immobilize cervical. 2 IVs. Hypothermia protocol. She's been in training, one of the crews said, and you could hear the diffidence at the edge of the statement because in those throes people say what they have. We never expected. Expect less and train for more, she answered. The line cut across the superstition of heroism like a sharp that leaves no blood. It was not an insult, it was policy. They moved as a single organism, muscle and technique braided. The med team worked on a pilot who looked small under the fluorescent light, color coming back to his cheeks like paint to a canvas. One by one, they pulled the surviving passengers. Some had cuts, some had broken bones, some had the stubborn silence of shock. Their faces told stories larger than any words would cover. The protagonist dictated the order to get them out, to triage and board and treat as the ground team coordinated ambulances. Each instruction was an anchor in a churning sea. When the havoc was contained, the hangar closed around the work with the kind of exhausted silence that follows danger. The gatekeeper, who had been in motion like a man keeping a show afloat, stopped and looked at the protagonist with something that was no longer arrogance. There was a tremor at the edge of his brow, a narrowing that had no need for costume. How? He began, and then shut the question because it would have required humility. He had never been comfortable in that currency. The cadet, who had rung the small token like a bell in his hands, felt the world tilt. What had been a public slight a few hours earlier had rippled into something that taught him the difference between presence and effect. He looked at the protagonist and wished to be made that way, steady, unpuffed, functional in wonder. You didn't have to, he said, voice raw. He meant he did not have to come and prove anything for them. She had come because people needed help. You could have let us. Let you, she said. Her words were an exact instrument. And if I had, who would have taught you how to hold a sight when the world shakes? The work is the teacher. We all learn, continuously. After the hospital vans took the injured away, the hangar slowly emptied. The sounds thinning were small, boots against concrete, the click of a control panel powering down, the blade of a fan whispering overhead. Around the protagonist's elbow, people condensing into a sort of reverential distance, the gatekeeper hovered. He was not ready for the public apologies that sometimes accompany such moments in lesser men. Instead, he had a private, fumbling attempt at humility. Ma'am, he said, using the title as a bracing rope. You were right. About presence. He searched for the restraint that would keep his ego from leaping into apology and instead found a simpler truth. I judged you on how loud you were. You thought you could measure me by how much space I occupied, she finished. She did it without triumph, because triumph is a loud luxury, and she had been given enough of a show. The gatekeeper's mouth twitched into a semblance of a smile that bore no mockery now, only the awkwardness of someone not used to the small and hidden forms of competency. I'm sorry, he said. It was short, so short it could have been swept underfoot. But apology is an instrument. It needs regular practice to sound like sincerity rather than ritual. There would be a reckoning later, where the gatekeeper would have to live within the terms of the humility he had discovered in a moment of crisis. Later that evening, the protagonist sat at a bench outside the mess hall, the cool of the night a net that took in the light from the field and limited it to pinpricks. The cadet joined her. He had not been born to be silent, but he was learning the discipline of listening, which is a different kind of mastery. You could have been anyone, he said, breaking the quiet like a pebble causing a ripple. The way you moved. They said you were a myth. They made you an explanation. Why don't you tell us where you came from? If you're an instructor, tell us your. My past is not the measure of how I teach, she said. What matters is technique, practice, the willingness to return and do the small things day after day. That's how we survive. That's how we pass the torch. Do you ever miss it? The loudness? The recognition? He pressed, as boys press at the edges of what is forbidden when they are trying on the shells of their future selves. I used to think recognition was a form of currency, she admitted. But currency changes the heart. If you value praise, you will maneuver for it. If you value work, you will keep to the work even when no one applauds. Which do you want to be? He held the token in his palm, feeling its weight. I want to be useful, he said. The phrase had the vulnerability of a prayer. I don't want to be loud. Good, she said. Start by cleaning your rifle every night for a month. Learn to soak in the boredom of the task. When you can find meaning in repetition, you'll find steadiness. Then you can teach it. He nodded like a man making an oath. In his mind, he filed the instructions next to other ones. Clean the barrel, check the sights. Unromantic, simple, durable. The night hummed. Beyond the barracks lights, the airfield lay like a beast with a closed eye, and the protagonist's breath came even, the rhythm of someone who had made a living out of templates and adaptation. Weeks later, the pilot's family visited. They sought the protagonist in the quiet of the med bay and found her straightening instruments, hands never idle. The pilot, young and resilient, had recovered in the way that some do, quickly, stubbornly. His mother grasped the protagonist's hand, and for a moment the world narrowed to pulses of gratitude, a human thing that cannot be catalogued into medals. "You saved him," the mother said, voice a low tangle of tears and thanksgiving. "You saved my boy. How can we ever?" "Do the small things," the protagonist replied, and for once, she allowed the sentiment to tilt towards softness. "Teach him to check his equipment. Teach him to check himself. And tell his friends to do the same. We will keep him safe as long as there are people who practice the necessary habits." The mother cried openly then, and the cadet, who had been standing just behind her, felt his chest stir, something like the beginning of a conviction. He wanted to go back to the hangar and begin the tedious worship of competence, cleaning, checking, practicing until his hands knew the machine the way his mouth knew his name. He wanted to be the kind of person who could be trusted without fanfare. The story found its way, inevitably, into the barracks' spoken lore. People told and retold the incident in small variations. Some turned it into a parable about preparedness. Some called the protagonist by nicknames that made her into a symbol. The gatekeeper found himself the subject of gentle ribbing and, more importantly, of introspection. He began to visit training sessions not to assert authority, but to learn. He sought the protagonist out with notebooks in hand, and a humility practiced like a muscle. "Teach me the sequence," he said one day while the protagonist showed a group of new recruits how to pack a parachute with both speed and deliberation. He did not assume his presence was commanding, he asked. The cadets watched the transformation. This man who had once derided the quiet now accepted instruction openly, and his manner softened. "Slow is efficient," she told him. "Haste is the enemy of precision. Be precise first. Then you can be fast." "What about being loud?" he asked, almost shy. "Reserve it for the rare times when the situation calls for it," she said. "Otherwise, save the air. Let your actions be loud enough." The barracks bulletin board grew a new artifact, a grainy photo taken of the protagonist in the immediate aftermath of the medevac, hands smeared with ash and a small cut on her cheek. Captured in the frame was the clarity of a person at work, no pose, only purpose. Someone affixed a handwritten note beneath it. "Keep the rifle clean. Respect the quiet." It became a kind of totem. New cadets would stop and read it, sometimes with a smile, and sometimes with the furrowed brow of someone deciding to change. Across time, the legend expanded not by embellishment of action, but by the repeated telling of details that mattered. How she tied knots with the economy of a man who had done it in rain. How she used the same sequence to check thermals in a gliding emergency as she did to calibrate a sniper's sight. How she had learned not to value applause and to rely instead on the deeper reward of competence witnessed in the steady breathing of someone you had saved. The story spread like a pattern in cloth, repeated into a durable design. There were other moments of quiet heroism, smaller in drama, but equal in moral heft. The protagonist found a recruit on the edge of panic and showed him how to breathe through the rhythm of his heartbeat. She held a winter's lecture on the etiquette of folding bandages so that they would hold in frost without slipping. She taught a squad how to move silently through brush and what to do when one's GPS failed in the middle of a navigation exercise. Every lesson was small, mundane, but gathered like straw into a winter-thick stack of resilience. At times, an old contact from the protagonist's classified past called on the secure line. They would speak in low registers about things they could not record, and she would answer with brief reports. These conversations, brief and procedural, were the echoes of her earlier life, the one she did not talk about because to announce it would be to turn it into commodity. She kept those histories in a folder no one read. They were her ledger, not her trophy case. "Do you ever regret letting it go?" the cadet asked once, In a moment where they were squinting at a twilight sky, attempt at metaphor thick as any earnest teenager can muster. He wanted not her philosophies, but the inside of her decision. I regret nothing we couldn't fix before it breaks, she said. We are judged by what we do when the expected fails. The past, she tapped the corner of her mental file. The past is evidence. The present is proof. And the future is what you build from both. She looked at him as if measuring the span between the words and the boy's face. Start with small proofs. The gatekeeper, who had by now learned to speak with fewer syllables where it counted and more when listening mattered, underwent a subtle redemption. Not because he sought or courted it, but because he had been given a taste of what true authority felt like. The sense of responsibility, a discomfort that cultivates humility. He stopped mocking the quiet and began to defer, sometimes publicly, sometimes in private interviews, credit where it was due. His change did not make him saintly. It made him human, which is rarer. Occasionally, a rival voice would rise in the netted rooms of the barracks online forum, claiming the protagonist had staged the medevac as a set piece, or that the gatekeeper's insult had been merely banter. Folk who had never smelled gun oil or seen an aircraft skid into a runway with a wing giving way found, from the comfortable distance of screens, that they could rearrange truth for rhetorical advantage. The protagonist heard such things and did not respond. Silence is sometimes a shield of dignity. Sometimes it is a way to direct the glare away from the person and toward the work that needs doing. When a new memorial wall was proposed by some ambitious architect of ceremonies, the protagonist refused to be enshrined. Monuments can mislead, she said to the board. We need instruction. We need clinics on triage, drills on emergency landing protocols. Put money into training, not statues. Her logic was simple and infuriating to those hungry for tidy narratives. They wanted to pin her story to bronze and call it finished. She wanted action that would teach others to perform the same small miracles. The choice was controversial, but in the end the board, chastened by reality and by the practical demands of maintaining life, funded a training wing named informally in the barracks as the Quiet House, an austere space where recruits learned not the art of being seen, but the craft of being useful. They hung that grainy photo on the entryway, not as worship, but as reminder. You could have demanded recognition, the cadet said on the night they opened the wing, the ribbon cut in a private ceremony. You could have taken medals, interviews. Why did you choose a teaching space? Because competence reproduces, she said. A statue doesn't teach anyone how to bind a wound. Years later, an enlisted man who had been a cadet that week stood before a group of new recruits, the same token he had once carried into the hangar, now slightly smoother at its edges. He told them the story not as myth, but as a ledger, the medevac, the calm that saved an aircraft, the quiet correction of an arrogant man. He told them how a woman who spoke in barely more than necessary had taught him the meaning of steady hands. He taught them to clean their rifles with the same solemnity of a man lighting a candle. He taught them the small rituals, the cadence of salute, the fold of a bandage, the exact breath before a shot. He taught them to be teachers for their successors. And the protagonist? She continued to do the work. She would walk through the training wing at dawn when the light was a narrow blade, and watch as the new recruits practiced kit checks, the dull thud of boots like a metronome. She would correct a stance, set a jaw, show a pair of hands how to tie a knot that would not fail under stress. The corridor of her days was ordinary in the way that iron is ordinary, unadorned but essential. In the evenings she would write notes, short and economical, to be filed under the names of those she had taught, a ledger of small corrections and small successes that collectively read like a life. The gatekeeper, who had learned to harbor humility like an extra parka against cold assumptions, would often linger at the edge of a session, watching more than speaking. Once, when a new recruit faltered in panic and dropped her rifle, it was the gatekeeper who, with a hands-on competence he had earned, steadied the girl's shoulders and taught her to breathe. The girl looked at him with a new kind of respect. The gatekeeper's face reflected a man who had learned to take instruction and then pass it on without ego. Far beyond the base, in quiet meetings and in the slow building of protocol ledgers, the protagonist's methods became a part of the curriculum in other installations. People who could never have imagined themselves heroes found themselves learning the rites of survival. How to clean a site space, how to check a parachute, how to place a tourniquet in the dead of night with one hand. The legend grew, not by becoming larger than life, but by being repeated in the small details that build lives. A salve in a pocket, a checklist left open on the hood of a truck, a hand placed steady on a shoulder. They told stories of how then gatekeeper had become a scrubbed, earnest teacher of the small things. They told stories of how the pilot's children grew up with lessons in precision that made them more careful than their peers, how the cadet, the one with the token, went on to teach others to respect the craft of quietness. The netted room still buzzed with commentary, but a different tone threaded through, an appreciation for the slow, stubborn accumulation of competence. In the quiet of the barracks storeroom, the protagonist kept a small, battered notebook. She used it to record the incidents that mattered, small edits to procedures that saved seconds and lives. It was not a memoir. It was a manual of living adjustments. She wrote with the kind of brevity that makes sentences last. On a page one night, she wrote a single sentence. Teach the next one to breathe before the trigger. Under it, she drew a line and left the rest blank, as if to leave space for others to add their lessons. Her legacy, if one insisted on word like that, was not a line in a ledger or a name etched in metal. It was found in the small rituals repeated on gray mornings and in the cadence of how new hands learned to check their packs. It was in the way a gatekeeper learned to ask before he accused, and in the way a cadet with a worn token learned to pass competence forward without seeking applause. It was in the stubborn replacement of loudness with function. And yet the world always seeks an image, a symbol, and so they kept the photograph in the entrance hall not as a shrine, but as a reminder that sometimes the most decisive voice is the one that says next to nothing and does everything. The caption beneath it read, simply and with economy, do the work. The recruits read it, scratched at pen and paper notes during the lectures, and sometimes whispered it to themselves before a stressful exercise. The words, repeated, were small incantations against chaos. When new threats, metaphorical and real, rose in the wider world, the techniques they had honed in the quiet house traveled to foreign bases, to rescue operations, to medevacs in storms. People called for help. Teams arrived who had in some way sat under that teaching, who had been the recipients of the discipline of repetition. They acted the way the protagonist had taught them to, not with fanfare, but with focus. That was how institutions change, through an accrual of small, repeated actions that outlast personalities and propaganda. In the end, the significance of the story was not found in the heat of the initial moment, but in the slow accrual of behavior. Loudness was still attractive, like a perfume that smells of certainty. But the quiet competence, like a scent of clean linen and oil, permeated and persisted. People who had once laughed at silence learned to differentiate between emptiness and depth. The protagonist, who had never desired the spotlight because light is a poor tool for repair, watched the slow reorientation of values with the same dispassionate satisfaction as one watches a well-executed plan come to fruition. There would be more incidents, of course, small crises that tested new recruits and veteran staff alike. There would be exercises that revealed old habits and required retraining. There would always be the human tendency to forget and to need reminders. But the teaching had taken root. The cadet with the token carried it on missions, sometimes as a talisman, sometimes as a proof. He would tell his children and their children's children that a woman who spoke in few words taught him the value of the long work. He kept the token polished, not for vanity, but for the physical reality that the tactile reminders hold an authority of their own. And in the archive room, near the end of a long day when the light finally surrendered to the gray of dusk, someone would file a personnel entry and pause at the line that had once been a whisper of suspicion. They would read the list of assignments and the tally of hours, the places and the medals, small inked evidence of a life of service. But if they wanted the truth of her worth, they wouldn't find it in that folder alone. They would, if they were patient enough, find it in the hands of those she had taught, in the small rituals that kept these people alive, and in the new attitudes of those who once judged her by noise. Do the work, the recruits would whisper to one another before the night watch, as if saying it aloud made the world slightly more survivable. The phrase would travel, mutating in the mouths of those who needed it, and smoothing into a philosophy not of grand gestures, but of lots and lots of small corrections. They would teach their own recruits in that cadence, Clean, check, breathe, repeat. The protagonist, when asked again in quieter moments whether the world had changed because of them, would offer nothing magniloquent. She would make tea for the night watch, hold a lithe hand to steady an anxious one, teach a precise knot. She would continue the trade of repair. In her ledger, that would be enough. The quietness of her existence was not absence, but occupancy of a craft that is weary and noble and necessary. And so, quietly, the work continued. The small habits spread. The gatekeeper became a teacher of routine. The cadet became a man who could teach others to breathe. The photograph remained, a quiet admonition to do the small things. The token continued to be carried. The anecdote that had once been a rumor now read like a manual for living. One line of instruction repeated until the world acquiesced and learned. The protagonist kept her hands busy, because hands must keep busy if they are to keep things working. She kept her mouth quiet, because words distract from the cadence of work. She kept the ledger of small victories in a battered notebook, and when asked to read a line aloud, she would simply state, "Understood."